All right, so we've come to the last chapter of the book, which deals with global media in the digital age. Now, why this is so important is because of the transmission of information that's taking place because of the advancements in technology, the speed of the internet, and things of that nature. But one of the first things we have to point out when talking about the idea of media in the global industry is that of the different theories that exist around the world. Now, when we talk about these specific theories that exist around the world, what we're looking at here is that several American social scientists presented 4 theories of international mass communication. And this happened around the 1950s, and it kind of describes the way that those specific governments treat or regulate the mass media. The first one is known as the authoritarian theory. This is the oldest system of mass communication, and it exists in authoritarian states that exert direct control over the mass media. Again, that's direct control over the mass media. This exists in communist countries such as China, Cuba, and North Korea. The second type is called the libertarian theory. Now, this says that the individual should be free to publish whatever he or she likes. Now, what does that mean? That means that if the journalist or the media specialist believes that something should be published or should be broadcast, then it should be broadcast. Essentially, the media professionals are given full autonomy, meaning full control, within their organizations. Now, the problem that comes into that is that, as we've discussed throughout this semester, is that much of the media content that exists because of the production or the creation of revenue that can come from that. Well, if you're giving full autonomy to the media professional may be ignoring some of the bottom line issues, the monetary issues. So that's where some of the problems run into the libertarian theory. The third one we have is called the social responsibility theory. Now, this best describes the mass media in most democratic societies such as the United States, Canada, France, and the United Kingdom. Media should be free from most governmental constraints to provide reliable information to the public. The key there being most governmental restraints. The government does still exert some power and control over the mass media and social responsibility theory, but they do tend to stay out of it as much as possible unless it violates certain codes or conducts that have been established. And you have the Soviet theory. Now, the roots of this are in the communist system of government control over the press, and it can be traced all the way back to 1917 Russian Revolution. Media are subordinate to the government and only partially censored because journalists are supposed to self-regulate content. So it's kind of a mixture of a few of the different ones that we've talked about. Media should serve the interest of the working class and should be publicly, not privately owned. So the government does exert power over it, but the journalist gets to control the information being presented, because a key to keep in mind is that journalists in many ways here understand who it is that they're serving, and they are regulating it themselves based on what it is that they're understanding. Now, some of the political and socioeconomic issues with global media is that media in developing countries. Now, we talk about specifically media in developing countries. Something we have to understand that the media and other communication technologies are powerful instruments for economic development around the world. Western companies seek out developing countries such as India as sources for relatively cheap software development and computer programming workers. As an English-speaking country, India has become the major producer of media content, including recorded music, motion pictures, news media, etc. Now, critics have observed that moving information processing work overseas is no different than sending factories overseas to obtain cheap labor. So some of the same discussions are taking place as took place when it goes to moving factories or moving production of maybe automobiles or other things across the lines and across the borders. So that's something in the developing countries that has to also be kept in mind. Now, searching for truth, self-censorship in China. Now, as we've all heard and we know, China is a country that absolutely regulates mass media much more than that of the United States. China is an Asian market that is very attractive to Western media, though, because there is a large potential for consumer market. However, China blocks access to a wide range of websites, from pornographic sites to those perceived as being critical of the government. So it's, as much as we look at it as a possible consumer market, we also have to understand that the government in China very much controls the messages that are being sent. Facebook is not a site that people in China would have access to, because there is a great amount of control and censorship in China that happens. So that also leads to the next idea, that of the digital divide. The access to the internet in developed nations is as high as 80% for people who have web access. So 80% of people in developed nations have web access. In countries such as Iceland, Sweden, and Norway, that is even higher, over 90% of access to the web. As more as more people worldwide get access online, the gap between those who have access to the internet and those who do not further widens. This phenomenon is what we know as digital divide. So the digital divide is kind of a separation between the haves and the have-nots of those who have web access. North America has an internet penetration rate of 78.6, so we're pretty close to that 80% mark across the continent, across the North American continent. However, Africa's rate is only 15.6%. So we're looking at a great distinction between the internet haves and the have-nots, just between North America and Africa. One being 78, almost 79%, and the other being 15.6, almost 16%. So it's still a great divide that exists there, and something also that has to be worked on in order to try to create as little distinction between the haves and the have-nots as possible. It's kind of the modern day version of literacy, where in the past people did not have the ability to read and therefore they didn't have access to information. Well, if people don't have access to the internet, in many ways they're not having access to the information that the rest of us in the developed world have had the ability to get. And so that's something else that's important to note. Now, global media and local values. New worlds or cultural imperialism. Possibility that citizens absorb alien cultural values that can conflict with traditional ones. So we talk about new worlds being created in many ways. What's happening is the term cultural imperialism captures the idea that global media giants promote their programming in foreign markets. So, for example, in the United States, much of the content that we create is also broadcast and published in foreign countries. Well, the concern comes in is that the alien cultural values can conflict with the traditional ones, and in fact, sometimes even the alien cultural values, meaning us in the United States going over into another country with our media, could possibly cut into the quality of cultural values that exist within that particular location. Now, convergence in its contents. Media convergence may also encourage increased cultural homogeneity. Now, what that means is essentially a single culture, particularly given the common ownership of various media types, horizontal integration such as book publishers, newspaper chains, TV station groups. As we've looked at in the past, the ownership is a worldwide form of ownership, not just each country has its own ownership. And because of that, we're becoming more of a homogeneous society, one single culture that is transmitting from one country to another, but still with the same musical interests, the same film interests. And that's some of the concern that starts to happen with some local values are changing. For example, if you were to walk into a Walmart here in California, it looks very similar to a Walmart in Nevada if you were to walk into one. That's a homogeneous department store. Okay, they try to make them all look the same. The same thing is starting to be said in many ways about our mass media and the radio and television and movie production, as well as the written word. And so those are some concerns that start to take place within the global media market. Also, globalization of media production. It's increasingly becoming an international phenomenon. What do we mean by the fact that it's becoming an international phenomenon? Meaning no longer is something being created just for the purposes of being consumed in the Western culture. It is now also being created in the Western culture or the Eastern culture and being broadcast in the Western or the Eastern culture. So much more globalization is starting to take place. So much more globalization of the media production. Media production is an international phenomenon because many movies actually make more money in foreign countries than they do in the United States where they were actually produced. These kind of joint ventures have significant economic benefits for both the American and the foreign media market. One of these effects, such as internationalization, is the program is recreate common Hollywood codes and conventions derived from already popular genres. So in order for something to kind of cross these lines, you're seeing that things are actually being created with the international perspective in mind. Many big budget movies are actually being created purposefully to do well in foreign markets. The Fast and Furious series is one of those examples. You'll see that in many ways they go to different countries to shoot these. They go to different locations to shoot these, not only to serve the market that they have, which is the United States, but also the worldwide market that exists within that. So global media flow. Advances in digital technology have altered the debate about intercultural communication. It used to be seen as a way that maybe more miscommunication could take place. It used to be seen as a way that maybe more problems could exist within the mass media and intercultural communication. However, now it's being looked at as technology advances as something that can actually enhance our understanding of one another and maybe enhancing ideas of people from another country or another location that maybe we might not have the opportunity to ever go to. Research shows that 80% of news distributed globally has been historically produced by Western news agencies based in New York, London, and Paris. Now, the downside of that, though, talking about it from an intercultural perspective, is that also has us look at maybe certain cultures as being more powerful than other cultures, and that's where we can also cut into some of the quality of intercultural communication. So even though there's some advancements that have taken place in terms of intercultural communication, the way we treat people from other cultures and our understanding of people from other cultures, it also has in many ways provided more power to the Western cultures because they're being consumed by larger audiences and larger groups of people. Now, protecting local values is also something. Many media critics argue that Western media dominate the global flow of news and also display commercial and corporate bias. As a counterbalance, many countries try to provide alternatives to foreign influx of media by strengthening their internal media content production. So they've actually created certain groups in order to continue, in order to enhance, in order to grow their local values or their local voice. So they've put money into the arts. They've put money into maybe the news production and the journalism that exists in other countries in order to continue the local value and the local voices that exist within those particular countries. So in some ways, even though it is threatening the local voice, in some ways it's actually putting more emphasis on the local voice as well. And many governments fund, like I said, the internal production of music and other forms of media in order to continue to keep that cultural value and that cultural significance within its location. Now, cybersecurity is another thing that we're having to be concerned about when it comes to the global media. Media convergence brings countries and people closer together, which is really cool. And we've already talked about the fact that it's really cool. But as this grows, new challenges for local cultural identity and global national security also grow. So hackers from many countries have tried to break into Western computer networks. We've even had in our most recent election the idea that maybe Russia or other countries have possibly interfered with the United States election. Whether it happened or not, this is starting to become something that is more on the forefront of our discussions. Another area of concern is that the internet by terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and other forms could be using the internet in order to crash economic systems, in order to affect individuals. So this is a whole nother area that we're having to explore, and something that I think maybe 5-6 years from now we're going to have a little bit of a better understanding on. But right now is still very new and something that's very undiscovered because of the advancements and the quickness of technology and the way that things are being utilized. So that's it for this chapter.